and time again, a traveler in Eastern Europe would find that people lived together, but apart. Goodbye Eastern Europe, page 119. Not too long ago, we held the premiere of our documentary movie, The Glorious, at the History Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. There were some interesting moments of disagreement involved, something to be completely expected at any sort of shindig involving the history of Slavs. But there was also a fantastic question from the audience. How do we know what is true? Now, this wasn't a question about methods of historical research, but rather a request for help. In a place like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where horrific and bloody wars have been fought over history's smallest details between neighbors and within families, how can a person tell if the history they're reading is history or propaganda? After all, the best propaganda contains at least a seed of the truth. In a world where even official history is suspect, and where accident of birth determines the format of the history a person learns, how can anyone be sure that what they think they know and what they base their decisions on is true? There is little trust left in believing anointed experts who have too often in recent years proven to have loyalties above their commitment to honest learning. What is true is complicated because, contrary to common belief, history absolutely does change. Motivations are increasingly uncovered. Dates move up and down the calendar. Stories are discovered to be fact, and facts are discovered to be stories. Just 20 years ago, the world was divided over whether Richard III was the monstrous Shakespearean hunchback or a victim of propaganda. The discovery of his bones and an obvious spinal curvature proved it was a bit of both. The problem is, to paraphrase Tony Fabianchitz in his book Tracing the Footsteps of Gavrilo Princip, there seems to be a combination of perfect self-assurance and complete error in many people's beliefs about history. And to add to that, in my own words, no one ever really wants to be wrong, especially if being wrong comes with the existential crisis of having built a life and a belief system entirely on a lie. This is one of the most interesting issues that is tackled in Jacob Mikanowski's book, Goodbye Eastern Europe, An Intimate History of a Divided Land. For those of us that have lived in Eastern Europe or grew up in a family steeped in its Eastern European descent, the history and anecdotes Mikanowski writes about are like being vindicated on paper. There's a thread of absurdist and dark humor that runs through everything to do with life in the borderlands of empires. Mikanowski starts off with a story about his Aunt Jadwiga, whose attempts to get married to her long-term fiancé in the early to mid-1940s were thwarted for various reasons twice, and then finally resulted in an official marriage after 6 years, even though she wasn't present for the ceremony. Mikanowski begins at the beginning, with the origin of the Slavs and their pagan roots. It's an absolutely vital part of understanding Eastern Europe, because those pagan beliefs never really disappeared, they just reinvented themselves within the new religion of Christianity. For me, an American married into a Russian family, having to sit quietly for a few minutes before heading off interrupts my groove. I just want to go. Let me go. For my mother-in-law, an educated woman who escaped the Soviet Union one step ahead of an appointment in the Gulag, such rushing out the door was absolutely unthinkable. Who knew what mischief the domovoi might get up to if I didn't give them a chance to disentangle themselves from my legs before starting out? Mikanowski also addressed the issue of slavery, the massive slave trade in Slavs, that is still echoing on the verge of violence in parts of Eastern Europe today. Contrary to the assertions of those who wish to downplay some forms of historic slavery, the Slavic slave trade was absolutely brutal. Mikanowski tells us on page 12 that eunuchs were considered best. According to a contemporary manual, an uncastrated Slav would always stay coarse and simple-minded, but a castrated one was capable of every refinement. And rather than dismiss this as ancient history, it's worth noting that the Slavic slave trade coexisted with Mozart. There is still a cultural echo sounding through Eastern Europe. One of the most interesting parts of Mikanowski's book for me dealt with the different religions and ethnicities within this conglomeration of different nations lumped together as Central and Eastern Europe. From the arrival and development of Jews to the complex relationship of Christians and Muslims, Mikanowski uses examples both historic and personal to show the complexity of a world the West would rather simplify. The heroes of Southern Slav legends who fought the Ottomans also fought for them. Holidays and village remedies had their own form of syncretism, and religious respect was often shown in the most astounding of places. One of the stories Mikanowski relates is between the Ottoman Empire and Poland. Defeated most humiliatingly in Vienna by Sobieski's charge down Kahlenberg in 1683, when Poland's partitions by Russia, Austria, and Prussia began less than 100 years later and the nation disappeared, the Ottomans kept the Polish ambassador at his post. Until 1918, they would begin every audience with Western powers by saying, "The deputy for Poland has not yet arrived." We may want to make history simple, but it never is. As Kristaps Andrēsens, one of our experts in the Glorious, stated, the Slavs live in the very borderlands. Mikanowski details life for those caught between major powers: Russia, the German-speaking world, and the Ottomans. The absurdities that developed as each of these great empires calcified and collapsed shaped the Eastern European sense of dark, absurdist humor, culminating in one of the most definitive books in Eastern Europe, which brings Slavs everywhere together in uproarious laughter: The Good Soldier Švejk. Anyone wishing to have an understanding of the way the mind works in Eastern Europe should probably start with Švejk. But these borderlands and empires themselves laid the very foundations of the nationalist conflicts that arose later, and which are still often simmering just below the surface. As Mikanowski says on page 121, for when one people owned the land and another worked it, who deserved to inherit the state? It's a question that communism was definitely supposed to address, but since that system collapsed, the uproar has only continued on unabated. Woe to the person who tries to purchase property anywhere in the former Yugoslavia, as foreign investors and even foreign governments have found out time and time again. Eastern Europe has been a land of tragedies throughout history. Most of them have been long forgotten by anyone outside the families immediately affected, where the stories of injustice have passed down through generations, stoking a simmering resentment that is sometimes allowed to boil to the surface. But those tragedies that lie closer on the timescale, like World War II and the horrors committed under communism, still tickle the back of Western minds when the subjects come up. But even then, it's just not a complete understanding. In the West, we fought and defeated Hitler. That chapter is closed, and we're moving on to a better future. But In the former Yugoslavia, Mikanowski details an entirely different experience of war on page 225. During the years of German occupation, the territory of Yugoslavia was home to several wars at once. One pitted Germans and Italians against the Allies. Another was directed at the Yugoslav resistance. A third was directed by Croatian extremists against their Serbian opponents. A fourth was fought between Serbia, between two main groups of the Yugoslav resistance, the multi-ethnic communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito and the Serb-dominated pro-monarchist Chetniks. With no reliable allies, Bosnia's Muslims fought on nearly every side of this conflict and found themselves perpetually caught in the crossfire. This type of war, unlike the war fought by the West, doesn't end with Hitler's defeat. It can't, because that was only one of the wars being waged. The others just went into hibernation until something came along to wake them up. Given current events, this is an understanding the West needs to come to pronto. Mikanowski's book isn't long, about 320 pages, and it's definitely an overview of Eastern European history and culture, but it so directly relates to current events in the world today that I would say it has to be read by anyone interested in understanding. How can one understand the mindset of people who just keep grinding on in terrible circumstances without understanding the legacy of communism, as detailed on page 272? Inferior goods ruled the market, that is, when they were available at all. It was a world of envelopes that wouldn't stick, pens that didn't write, and matches that wouldn't burn. When you don't expect something to work, you aren't disappointed when it doesn't. But it also provides a peek, however brief, into the mindset of invasion on page 287. For while Eastern Europe was acquired by the Soviets as a buffer zone, in the long term, it proved to be a gate. It did not shield the Soviet Union from Western influence. It ushered them into the tent. An understanding, perhaps, that it isn't only the West who refuses to learn from history. The book is Goodbye Eastern Europe, an intimate history of a divided land by Jacob Mikanowski. And to answer the question from our documentary premiere in Sarajevo, here is a place to start. And here is history you can trust. But this really is only a place to start. You can only understand more if you read more. History is longer than the last 20 years, so go back further when you read. And you will never understand how all of these events and people relate to each other if you can't find these places on a map.